Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I'm thrilled to kick off Reunion Week with a panel of esteemed members of our community who are also reunioning this year as well as myself. I'm amazed that I'm celebrating my 30th year anniversary from graduating from NYU Stern. So to introduce our panelists, the first is Dana Onyewu, who is celebrating her 15th year reunion from Stern's MBA program. Dana is currently Vice President of North American Sales and Education for the skincare company TATCHA, leading Sephora business within the United States and Canada. She's spent her career in beauty and global product development, marketing, international business development, and commercial functions at companies like L'Oreal USA, Diva Curl. And while at Stern, Dana was the co-president of the Luxury and Retail Club, specializing in marketing and entrepreneurship. So please join me in welcoming Dana. Our second panelist is Ken Goldman, who's celebrating his 20th reunion from Stern's full-time MBA program as well. Ken is JP Morgan's lead equity research analyst for the US food producers and food retailers sectors. He's covered the industry since 2004 and is the managing director within the firm. In the Institutional Investor Survey, Ken has been ranked number 1 5 times and number 2 7 times. During a previous career as a producer with ESPN, he helped lead 2 Emmy-winning teams. And Ken has an MBA in finance from NYU, as I mentioned, and his bachelor's is from the University of Pennsylvania. So please join me in welcoming Ken Goldman. And last but not least, we have Lydia Morrish, who's celebrating her 5th year reunion from Stern's Executive MBA program. Lydia is also a member of the Stern's Alumni Council. Lydia is the global head of insights at JP Morgan Private Bank, and is responsible for leading global strategy and development and launch of key initiatives for the Wealth Management Insights program. Prior to joining JP Morgan, Lydia spent the first part of her career working for 2 global asset management firms in London, then later transitioned to professional services, where she worked in the asset and wealth management sector at PwC. Lydia, as I mentioned, has executive MBA, specializations in finance strategy and leadership from NYU, and a bachelor's of science in international business from American University. So please join me in welcoming Lydia Morrish as well. So before we jump into, really it's going to be a conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to then have some Q&A, so certainly think about questions along the way. So our goal is to talk about these 10 topics, 10 things you can do in the space of inclusion, diversity, belonging, and equity, even if you aren't in a role that is focused on that specifically. So we'll have a conversation about these 10 topics, and then we'll open up for questions for you to tune in. Please share your questions through the Q&A chat feature. We're recording the session, and along with each reunion session, we'll plan to make all these sessions available in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So thank you again for joining us and kicking off Alumni Week with us. Now I'll turn it over to the panelists. So the main concept is that there's these 10 things that someone can do in an environment to create an environment where everyone feels inclusive. But it takes all of us to think about how we can do these things. The first thing is being a mentor and being an advocate for someone that may be different than you in some dimension of how someone might identify. And so I'm going to start with you, Ken. Could you share maybe a story or some thoughts about how you've done this in your career?
Sure. And Gary, thank you very much for asking me to join. It's an honor to be here. First and foremost, I think I have people who work with me and work on my team, and I've gone out of my way to look for people who, don't look like me and don't have the same background that I do. And there's a particular reason for that, which is, and I know it's a cliche, and I know certain people in this country may not like hearing this, but diversity is a strength, right? And I truly believe that hiring people who are just like me with my background is not going to be nearly as additive as hiring people who have different backgrounds and different experiences. And so it's a little selfish. I actually want to learn from people. So I've gone out of my way at JP Morgan to really, look for individuals who I feel I can learn from, but also who I feel like I can help out, because it can be very scary to walk into a JP Morgan where, let's be honest, as much as JP Morgan, and I'm sure every bank and most companies in the country, as much as JP Morgan has strived and made great inroads over the years in hiring more women, hiring more people of color, hiring people of a lot of different backgrounds, you walk onto the trading floor here, it's a lot of white men, and it can be very intimidating for a lot of people. And I really try and make sure that, I don't speak to people and say, I understand who they are or what they've gone through or what they can bring. I just try and help them in ways that, I feel are useful to them and make them feel like they are part of, they belong here. And I think just going out of your way to being there, you don't have to do anything special. I feel like just be nice to people, reach out, talk to them. If someone's walking past you in a hallway, start up a conversation. And especially for me, I like to do that with people and individuals who I feel like, maybe, in a group that, like I said, people who are not exactly like me. I'm trying to be very sensitive in how I answer some of these questions, but and I feel like it's been extremely rewarding for me, and I think it's been great for the company. And just, again, it's nothing special you have to do is what I want to emphasize. Just be nice to people and kind of go a little bit out of your way. And it goes an incredibly long way.
Ken, you touched on so many things that I talk about. I teach, one of the classes I fortunate to teach at Stern is called Leading Inclusive Teams. And one of the things that I say is rule number one is that you have to change your mindset from, diversity and inclusion is quote, the right thing to do, meaning we're good citizens, we're good people, to it's a thing we need to do to be successful or to be as good as we can be, because the research shows that diverse teams outperform ones that are homogenous. And so it does require us to kind of have that mindset of thinking, this is going to make us better. But another thing that'll be a recurring theme that you're touching on is, beyond just bringing people into organization, how do you create the sense of belonging? And that is by being welcoming, so that people feel like I'm different from someone else, but I'm being welcomed here. And so the chances of, having retention issues down the road, go away. And certainly in this world of, posts or during whatever stage of the pandemic we are in, and knowing that there's a lot of resignations and people trying to find environments that feel more important to them, this becomes even that much more important. So, so I appreciate those thoughts. Yeah. So let's move on to our next topic, and that is organize a diverse selection committee when hiring in your organization. And Lydia, let's go to you for this one.
Great. Thank you, Gary. So I kind of look at recruiting through two different lenses. So one, it's having the selection committee, people, what we call on the interview slate, that represent different diverse backgrounds. And that's not just looking at it from making sure that we have, different races and cultures and ethnicities represented, but also people from different parts of the business. I think I work in marketing, for example, and so I don't want to have everyone on my interview committee all be in marketing, right? I think it's important to make sure that there's representation from different parts of the business as well, because that's part of that inclusivity. And so that's sort of one component of it. I think the other component is, and especially, growing up in the world of finance, it really is a white male dominated industry. I think, most people recognize that. And so even some of the schools that historically we would have recruited from, now we're starting to open up and look at other schools that perhaps have more diverse candidates, and again, making people feel like this is a place for you, right? You don't have to have just gone to the Ivy League school or just gone to, XYZ school or have these internships. We're really trying to bring people in from a variety of different schools and making them feel that, regardless of what your background is, regardless of what experiences you've had to date, JP Morgan, at least, is a place for you. So we sort of look at recruiting through those two different lenses.
Yeah, I think the thing about that is so important in the sense that, one of the things that's just a reality is we all have bias, and that's just the natural thing of who we are. Some of it's nature, some of it's nurture. And when you have a diverse selection committee and you bring in a diverse candidate pool, then it's like those biases end up kind of competing with each other versus, if you have a group that has one particular bias, then you're going to hire against that particular bias. And so by mixing it up, you get to have all these different perspectives on both sides, not just the selection committee, but, as you demonstrated, also having it in the candidate pool. So yeah, thanks for covering that. And we're going to kind of stay with you and bring Ken back. And then after this, we'll go to Dana. But what about the concept of starting an affinity group in your organization? You both are at JP Morgan, so I figured you both can kind of cover this. Maybe share some thoughts about how JP Morgan approaches affinity groups.
Lydia, you want to start?
Sure. So we have a number of what's called business resource groups, and it really is meant to show the breadth of all of the diverse people that we have across JP Morgan. And so some examples would be, we've got Women on the Move, Pride, trying to think of them off the top of my head, Bold, so the Black Organization Leadership Development. We have one for Next Gen. We have one for, I'm trying to think, Asia and Pacific Islanders. So there's across all different types of groups, and anyone can join, so it's not just meant for that particular culture. Anyone is welcome to join and learn and participate in the events, which I think has been really wonderful. One of the things that I would like to highlight was at the start of the pandemic, when we were hearing all of those horrible stories about, Asians being attacked and people sort of pointing the finger at them and saying, this is your fault. We actually had people from our Aspire group come and share their stories of things that were happening in their day-to-day lives. And I think that was really enlightening. So these groups are really meant to kind of, I think, shed light on people's experiences and sort of, how they bring that to the workforce. And also just giving people an opportunity to participate and learn more, across a number of different groups.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little bit of a JP Morgan session here, so I apologize for adding to that. But I think it's critical. Look, I don't agree with everything JP Morgan does, and I don't agree with everything Jamie Dimon does, but I can, although I'm on the JP Morgan Zoom right now, I probably shouldn't say that. But I will say that what's really important, and Lydia, you mentioned, some organizations within the company. To me, it's critically important how the firm really believes that diversity is important. And it literally comes from Jamie and it comes from the top. And if the top person at the firm is just someone who, pays lip service to it and starts affinity groups and says, great, we did it and we can check the box, you all know how that goes. And we get more emails, more messages about affinity groups and the resources being put behind them than I ever have seen in my life. And it's just getting more and more every year. And you can tell it's a passion, I think, for the people at the top of the firm. So I would just say that in any organization, unless it's coming directly from the top, unless it's supported directly from the top, it's really not going to work. And I feel fortunate that I've been in organizations where it's not like that. So I'm fortunate that we're in one here. And again, I don't want it to be an advertisement for JP Morgan. I'm not trying to make that. I'm just trying to say that, it can go both ways there.
Ken, I was going to say, I totally agree with that in terms of it's about the support at the top, because these ERGs, they need resources, they need money, they need, to be able to have time off to organize. And it is really important. So applaud JP, not a commercial for JP. I do not work for JP Morgan, but it is really, really important for the leaders of these organizations to put stock in things like ERGs.
Yeah, I don't agree.
I'm sorry, Gary.
Mm-hmm,
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead.
You said something that just rang true with me, which is giving people time off to do these things, right? I have a woman of color who works closely with me on my team, and she's always asking, can I work with this affinity group? Can I help these people? Because I want her to be her own mentor. And the answer is, of course, please. I want you to really enjoy your experience here, and I think it's great for you and the firm and so forth. And that is all the way up. Now, I can't promise it's like that everywhere in the firm, but again, I'm just giving an example of how I like it to be here. And I think being willing to say, okay, I need you here for work, but I realize that this is important too. And giving someone you work with time off to do this is critical. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I think so many good points. Dana brought up one thing. I was going to underscore this thing that you said, Ken, where it has to start at the top. But I also, love the names of some of the organizations that you were sharing, Lydia, because A lot of times people only think of these groups as resource groups, meaning that they're providing support for each other, which they should. But in addition, we need to think of them as empowered groups. And so that's why I love some of the names, because those are empowering names, and the fact that anyone can be part of those, because it's supposed to be educational in part. And so that's what's empowering for that group. And so the other thing Dana added, which was important too, is providing resources to that group, empowering them so that they can help the organization either diversify or learn or understand about these differences. So, you can definitely create just resource groups where people are protecting each other, which sometimes is needed in an organization, but it really gets powerful when you're saying, we're empowering you to help us either diversify and grow our intercultural competence. We can learn about each other better. So I think that's the right perspective. So thank you all for kind of providing some thoughts on that one. So,
and just to bring it back to one of your earlier questions around, recruiting and having the interview slate, we actually leverage those groups as well, to find diverse talent. I mean, I love how all of it just continues to sort of reinforce, regardless of what aspect you're looking at in the workplace. So that was one other thing I wanted to throw out, is one of the really beautiful things about having some of these affinity groups within your organizations is, being able to tap into them also to continue to recruit diverse talent.
Yep, totally true. Thank you for adding that. So now we're going to move to Dana, and the fourth thing we're going to talk about is diversify your network. So talk to us a little about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is one that is a challenge for me because I do not like to network. I know it's a tough thing. It takes effort for me, for sure, and I think for most people. So to diversify your network is even more effort, but it doesn't have to be super complicated. I think one of the things we were just talking about, ERGs, I mean, some of that is like within things that exist already in your company, you can be a part of those groups, which furthers your network, which, networking is, yes, for yourself, but it's also, you get those calls about, do you have anybody in mind for this role? Those sorts of things just help to kind of build out what you can also offer back to the networks that you're a part of. But also like doing things like NYU, like us, being able to connect and looking for folks that, are not of our backgrounds and connecting in that way with groups that we're already a part of. It can be simpler than you think, but definitely still takes effort.
Yeah, those are some great tools. I mean, right, think about when you went to school. Certainly Stern's a great start, and other networks and how you can expand. And actually relates to the next thing, which we're going to move over to Lydia, and that's support work events as an ally. Talk to us a little about that.
So within our marketing organization, we actually have a separate group called the DE&I Task Force. And then we also have our marketing community, and I happen to be one of the co-leads for that. And so we partner very closely with the task force on creating a cultural calendar, and trying to highlight different cultural events throughout the year. And could be as simple as just sort of doing a spotlight on an individual so that you can learn more about that particular culture, or someone was kind enough to actually host a cooking session and teaching, how to make a local dish that is, very authentic to a particular country or region. And so there's like a variety of things that you can also do. I know Ken was talking sort of top down is super important, but I think there's so many other things that you can also do sort of at the bottom up, really engaging with people day to day, whether it's, taking the 15 minutes to do a stand up and again, spotlighting in a particular culture. We try to do a variety of different formats just to get people engaged. And again, it's really just, I think, shedding light on how different we all are, and yet also what some of those commonalities are. And I think that's been a really nice thing to learn, is that as you're hearing what other people are doing in other parts of the world, how can you bring that to what you're doing in your day to day? So that's something that I've really enjoyed at a more, I'm going to call it local level at work.
Can I add just one more thing onto that, Gary?
Mm-hmm.
Just as we've been, one of the frameworks that we've been working with at my previous company at DevaCurl was around allyship versus being an accomplice. And so allyship, we were really trying to think about this in the context of a business setting. And so allyship is, if someone speaks out against something that feels uncomfortable in a meeting, a microaggression, something that doesn't feel right, an ally co-signs that and says, yes, that's right. An accomplice is someone who brings it up on behalf of the other group who has something to leave on the line. And so as we've been kind of moving through the business world, I have been trying to think about how to be an accomplice as well as an ally, which is uncomfortable. Again, this work is not necessarily comfortable, but just putting a little spin on it to even push what's happening even further, kind of in the context of your business setting.
Yeah, that's such a great point, because sometimes there's this almost overreaction. And so you might say, I'm going to take this on and be an ally to lead, but accomplice is the right approach, is that you don't have to be the lead person in addressing it. You can certainly support someone and provide some wind beneath their wings in terms of addressing something. So thanks for bringing that up. Real important point. So Dana, I'm going to stay with you. About, I think it was 2018, Russell Reynolds, well-known executive search firm, did this white paper on the role of the chief diversity officer, and they talked to 220 of the Standard & Poor's 500 chief diversity officers at the time. And they found that these roles are roles of high influence. They typically report to either the CEO or the chief HR officer, but they're not roles of authority because they don't typically have reporting lines into them. And so the next thing on our list is ask your chief diversity officer, or whoever the lead person is doing diversity and inclusion, how you can assist or support their work, because they typically don't have this large team underneath them.
Yeah, I think this is really important because, like, to your point, there's a lot of work and not necessarily a lot of hands to do it. So I think, asking what you can do, because a lot of it is, there's a lot of labor involved, and some of it is, you can help just by asking. So I think one thing I did want to circle back to was one thing that Ken said about, things being simple versus complicated. And I think aligning with your chief diversity officer to really provide, help is important within the structure. But I think outside of the structure, also helping your employees to just feel like they belong and be seen can be really important in furthering these diversity initiatives. So I would say, like, in partnership with, yes, doing kind of the structural things, the things that the chief diversity officer is moving, but also what you can influence in your own day-to-day and with your own employees is also kind of like one and the same.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect mindset. You as an individual, I think Lydia talked about within teams having, diversity inclusion, either task force or folks like that. But yeah, I think having this mindset of, well, what can I individually do by itself makes a big difference. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. So we're going to jump back over to Ken, and this actually covers a point you mentioned earlier, and that is being a connector to help others expand their network. We talked about network building, and we talked about, just the first topic in terms of mentoring others, but talk about ways you can help others expand their network in an organization.
So, as I mentioned earlier, these things don't have to be major endeavors, right? It can be as simple as making sure you introduce someone to someone else, right? Sort of the basic blocking and tackling of being a good human being or a good partner at work. I think sometimes, I'm going off on a little tangent here, Gary, I'll come back to your question, but I think sometimes we're asked at work to do something, or we see a volunteer opportunity, and I'm just thinking off the cuff here, and we think, or I think anyway, oh my gosh, I'm so busy. Myself, I have a wife and 2 kids, and I have a job that requires a lot of hours. How am I going to add something else to that? And then I participate, and I'm like, oh, that was 30 minutes, and I'll do it again next month. And it was incredibly rewarding, and it is great for other people, and it's great for me. And so I think it's really important to just recognize that these are not, we're talking about things you can do. It doesn't have to be this grand life-changing thing. It can be a couple little things here or there. And if everyone does a couple little things, the world can change. And Dana, you said, I forget exactly the phrase you say, but discomfort or uncomfortable. And, there's no change without a little discomfort, right? So, for me, I think it's always just making sure the number one thing, Gary, just to get back to what you were asking, is really just making sure that the people I'm close to here, who I know, who may not feel comfortable by nature, I'm introducing them to as many people as possible, and as many people above me who I know as possible too. So that's the kind of day-to-day thing that I can do. In a more formal way, it's hard for me to think about exact examples, to be honest. And I think maybe that's something I have to think about getting better, right? I've always thought of that as something more informal, kind of just a routine thing. But there are certainly things I can think about and learn to get better there, because frankly, I'm not doing enough on a formal level there yet.
Well, but I do think, Ken, the informal piece probably is more powerful, because it's really about getting into a practice of doing that. And, I would say anybody should think, who am I connecting? Who am I helping out? Are there people that are like me, or are there people that are different than me? And should I say every month I want to do something where I interact with someone who's maybe different and figure out how I can network and help them? Particularly when you're in a certain role. We have alums coming back. Most of us, probably have people reporting to us and people we're working with. So we're in these roles of influence now. And it's kind of just creating an informal practice of doing this. You're doing this just kind of very naturally, which ideally is the way it should happen. And so if anything, folks should maybe audit to see if they are doing that, so that they can then, change their practice if they're not, and make it become informal and more of a regular practice. So I think that that's the right way to approach it, really. Yeah.
Thank you for that. One last thing, just to tie a bow on that. The more you build your own network, the more you can introduce people to others.
Yes.
So the more people that I know, and it's again, it's this symbiotic thing where it's good for me, but it's good for other people. The more I can say to someone, you have this background, this person I know has a similar background, perhaps, I can introduce you via email, maybe you guys will grab coffee together, right? That kind of thing I've done on more than one occasion, and I find it very rewarding for both of those individuals.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I'm happy to announce that we're tracking perfectly on our mission and our journey to cover these topics. We've got about 3 left, and we've got questions building in the chat, so we're going to be able to move to those after these 3. So the next one is, and Lydia, we'll have you cover this, because I know you've got some interesting stories about developing and growing your intercultural competence. And, intercultural competence, just for the audience, is really about your ability to understand these differences and commonalities across all these different ways we might identify. And it could be based on gender identity, it can be based on nationality, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, body size type, age, ability status. There's so many different ways we might identify. And intercultural competence is understanding those differences as well as the things we might have in common. So with that kind of backdrop, I'll turn it over to you, Lydia.
Thank you. So I think one of my biggest eye-opening experiences in my working life was, I just graduated from undergrad and I went to live in London. I'm thinking, okay, the Brits, very similar to Americans. We speak the same language, there's a lot of similarities. So, how hard can this be? And I will say the adjustment was really, really challenging for me. I mean, there was other forces kind of going on in the world at the time. We were at the height of the Iraq War and Afghanistan. And so there was a lot of negative sentiment towards Americans. And that was really hard for me to overcome. And especially since I went over there not knowing anyone. But that aside, working in a global company overseas, little things really just stood out to me. So for example, my first job was in brand and advertising within an asset management firm. One of the biggest things you always think about is how you keep your brand consistent across the world. So you're taking an advertisement and translating it into a local language, and it doesn't work. The sentiment's not correct. It's not going to resonate with that particular audience. So how do you stay true to the company's values and the brand, but also making sure that it works at a local level? And there were a lot of instances like that where I had to sort of take a step back and recognize that even though you might feel like you understand aspects of the French culture or aspects of the German culture, it's actually quite different. And so I think in order to be successful in business, you have to have that flexibility built in. So that was my experience there. And then one thing that actually happened at Stern on my second global study tour, we went to South Korea and Japan. And my biggest takeaway from those 2 experiences, South Korea, it's an idea a minute. We're going to throw things and see what sticks. Whereas, with the Japanese culture, it was very much around we have to have consensus, and we're going to make sure that everyone's comfortable with this before we move forward with the ideas. And when you think about those two countries, even from an innovation standpoint, they're very different. And even though they're in the same part of the world. So I think just taking some time to pause in different moments and recognize that while you might think that geographically you're very close to one another, or, you know, we're all part of Western society, so we might have natural things in common there, there can also be very deep-rooted differences, and just being aware of that, I think, is really important in the workplace.
Yeah, terrific. That is so great. So, you know, the first 8 things we've been covering is really things that we can do and things to kind of help an organization create a sense of belonging for everyone. The reality of it is, which, you know, we can't just talk about all the great things that we can do. This sometimes can be hard work. And one of the things that Dana mentioned earlier was the concept of microaggressions. And that's when there are kind of brief, but maybe commonplace insults or things that are said or nonverbal actions that people do to people based on how they identify. And the problem with microaggressions is because they tend to be subtle, they're not usually addressed in an organization, but they can also create this sense of not feeling like you belong in the organization. It can lead to things like, am I good enough? Should I be here because I'm being treated a certain way? So one of the things I wanted to talk about was this concept of restorative justice, which is a process that comes from indigenous peoples from, you know, many years ago in different countries. But it's really about having dialogue about harm that was done and how that can be resolved. It's something that I've been trained to do, and I've done it at NYU Stern. I've done it between a faculty member and their class. I've done it between 2 students. I've done it between 2 administrators. And it really is a space that's separate from, say, human resources. And that's why D&I work sometimes needs to be separate from human resources, because it's not about punitive. It's more about repairing a relationship based on something that may have happened. So someone might say something to someone either in a conference room or one-on-one, and the person kind of doesn't know how to deal with it. So restorative justice is a way to do it. Ideally, you have someone who's going to be somewhat neutral and impartial and that both parties trust. But ideally, you know, you have someone kind of acknowledging maybe a harm that was created in the microaggression, and someone, you know, saying how it affected them. The one thing I always suggest with people with microaggressions is to focus on the actual microaggression versus the microaggressor. So it's easy to say, you're a bad person because you said this. It's better to say, you know, when you said this, this is how I felt, and talk about how it affects you as the individual. And if someone has, you know, the courage to share that to someone as someone who kind of caused that microaggression, it's important to just listen and to say, and help yourself understand why that was a microaggression for that person. Because it's not based on what you intended. Sometimes you'll say, oh, that's not what I meant, or I didn't really say that. It's really to focus on not what your intention was, but how it was received by the person. And so being someone who's able to have this dialogue, if someone has the courage to bring this up, but also to have the courage to bring it up if someone says something, which again is meant to be separate from a formal human resources process. And the challenge with this is that, you know, like I said earlier, we all have bias. We've all created microaggressions. You know, we might have all been the victim of microaggressions. But the important thing is to recognize that as long as we have bias, we're all going to cause these microaggressions. But an organization should figure out how to deal with it. And really, it can be done on an individual level. And sometimes when you tie it to something formal like human resources, it causes a problem. And I, you know, certainly I was just more stating that as one thing. No one has to add anything, but if I wanted to at least give some space if people did want to add something. But again, no pressure, because we have one more thing we're going to cover. And it's okay, because we just have 2 minutes before we cover the last thing and we go to the questions. We've got questions building. So I'm going to go back to Ken. And this is, again, understanding how you deal, how you and others deal with conflict, you know, because sometimes it's cultural. We have different backgrounds, and that may lead us to handle a conflict situation differently. But the main thing, one thing I talk about a lot with students at Stern is, there's lots of different ways people deal with conflict, but there's two dimensions we focus on is, how emotionally expressive someone is or is not, and how direct or indirect they are. Those are the two dimensions that make it the most challenging. And how can you flex your style based on those differences that you might come across? So Ken, any thoughts in terms of how you've had success dealing with conflict with people that might?
Yeah, I'm going to give an answer that if my wife heard would laugh at, because she would disagree that I'm good at this, but I think it's just listen. Mm-hmm. Just listen to the person. And this doesn't have to do with DEI or anything, that I think is specific to this, although I believe it's applicable to this. Just if someone has an issue, or you see two people arguing, and it's about this, or someone comes to you, just listen and don't try not to feel attacked, because generally the person coming to you is emotional and they feel attacked. I'm generalizing here, obviously, but the more you can listen and stay calm and, understand that people are, we're insecure beings by nature. And that's a good thing in the end, right? Because it makes us human. But I think people come in and someone feels attacked and they get their back up, and then that other person feels attacked. The more you can de-escalate and the more you can listen, you can actually build like lifelong friends. Again, this is way beyond the topic here, but I think it's really important because conflict can happen within the bounds of what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. You can build bonds where otherwise some people might just kind of reject someone and cancel them right away. I hope that makes sense. I'm kind of riffing a little bit.
No, it totally does. And I think again, this is all, for it to really work, it has to be organically natural. And, it is related to the topic, and I think that's the thing I think that's why this conversation is so helpful for anyone listening, because it's not like you have to learn all these new things. It's just doing some things that are common sense, right? Listen, right? Then that helps you de-escalate. And maybe see how someone's reacting before you react. So I think that's a great answer.
I want to add one thing. I think the only way that all of this works, including conflict, is if we're able to be uncomfortable and have difficult conversations. That applies to restorative justice, being able to address microaggressions, being able to understand conflict, is if we're able to create an environment within our companies and maybe even just within our teams, if it doesn't exist in a bigger way, to have these conversations that are uncomfortable but needed in order to kind of get it all out there and to really understand. So I am comfortable being uncomfortable. And I think for this kind of work, that's the only way this works.
Yeah, I think it is about comfortable with being uncomfortable. My screen, I think, froze briefly, so I'm back. So let's go into the audience questions we have. The first question, which maybe I'll direct to Lydia, because you covered this one a bit. How can you be an effective ally without overstepping? Is it appropriate to join an affinity group as an ally?
I think so. I think if I'm understanding the question, or maybe the subtext of the question, let's say, for example, I'll take our BOLD affinity group. So it's Black Organization Leadership Development. And I think what the question might be is, if I'm a white individual, do I feel comfortable joining that particular affinity group? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, and it also goes back to what Dana was saying, being comfortable, feeling uncomfortable. And I think that's been hard for me to also overcome, as well as, feeling at times like, what if I say the wrong thing? Or what if I use the wrong terminology? And the only way that you're going to grow is to learn. I say the wrong thing all the time, but I feel comfortable and confident enough that my colleagues will correct me and help put me on the right course if I do say or overstep in some way. So I think it really is just pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone and just, again, learning to embrace and ask questions. And you'll also learn a lot about yourself along the way.
Totally agree. Thank you. So the next question I'm going to answer is, how do you measure progress? And I'm just going to quickly give some thoughts, and then, because we've got other questions I want to get to. I think one way is climate surveys. You can always ask, your environment, how they feel. Do they have a sense of belonging? And you could track it based on how people identify according to all these different ways. The other thing is, many times we focus on recruiting, but we don't look at retention. And so is your retention, based on all these different ways of identifying, different based on how you're bringing people into the organization. I think those are two important things to think about when you're tracking and measuring progress. But that's a whole separate conversation we can have a conversation on, so I wanted to leave it at that. The next question is, how can you have these conversations at work if someone feels uncomfortable because of fearing they will say the wrong thing or disagreeing? Anyone want to? I can start. I would say that it kind of, what the last theme was is getting comfortable with the uncomfortable and kind of jumping in. But I think one thing that we do a lot, we do when students come in at orientation now, we talk about debate, discussion, and dialogue. And typically we're doing discussion every day when we're having a conversation. It's a back and forth and it's an exchange. You can have debate, it can be healthy or unhealthy. Debate's typically about facts. Discussion could be about opinions, feelings, facts. Dialogue is about feelings. And typically it's best when it's tied with how people identify and how they feel about their identity. And I think the challenge is that we're not going to be the expert on someone else and how they identify, and so with dialogue, someone shares some aspect of their identity and what it means to them. We have students answer 4 questions, which identities do they think about often? Which ones do they not think about often? Which ones they think will have the greatest impact in their life? And which ones are difficult to talk about for them? And they share whatever they want to share. And then everyone does that though, in small groups. And I've done that in some organizations. Everyone shares what they want to share. And that allows you to just listen. So you don't have to provide thoughts on what someone said because they're the expert on themselves. Your job is to listen and learn. And then when it's your time to talk, you talk about yourself. So that's a way to have these conversations without the uncomfortability comes from you having to speak with some measure of authority or understanding of some different aspect of dimension that you aren't an expert on. But we're all an expert on ourselves and how we see, how we identify. And so by focusing on what we know and listening to what we don't know is the way to manage it. So let's go to our next question. How can you give feedback to HR if they aren't providing a diverse selection of candidates? Any thoughts on that from the team?
So we actually have a separate group. We don't go through HR for our recruitment. So we actually have an acquisition team. And we'll just be very blunt about it, and it can be as simple as saying, I'm not seeing enough different ethnicities, or I feel like I'm only getting people that have this particular background as far as a skill set. I'm looking for this. And like I said, being able to leverage different groups across your organization and even individuals. So we had a candidate who came in and has single-handedly brought in 4 additional people over the last year simply because we tapped into her network. So I think there's so many different ways that you can go about it without having to rely on HR. And I think, going back to your point about it's not just, acquiring new talent, but it's also the retention part. And so I think the more in which you can say, hey, Gary, you've joined our firm. I really hope you're having a great experience. Can you help us recruit more people like you as well? We'd love to just be able to continue that openness and feeling like we want to just bring people from all different backgrounds. And as you mentioned, not just educational backgrounds, but socioeconomic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, and the more that we can sort of leverage our own people and not just relying on HR and formal process, I think you get to a good place.
And there are recruitment firms, to Lydia's point, that specifically will recruit candidates according to your specs. So if you're in charge of writing the job rec, you can also specify that in those companies.
I would also, if I could just add one quick thing to what Lydia and Dana are saying, it happens sometimes. There's unconscious bias, and I've had experienced that where this is, no bias is harmless, right? But when I've been given sets of resumes and they are white males from Ivy League schools, and I'm like, I don't want that, right? I mean, I've actually, even though I went to Penn, I've had extremely bad luck with hiring people who went to Ivy League schools. I feel like they don't necessarily fit into the culture here. I like people who, well, I'll just leave it there. And so, I mean, I feel like, what I do is I go to the individual who's providing the resumes, and I say, hey, do you have other people with different backgrounds? And I remember the individual said, oh, that, I didn't even realize I was providing this. Maybe I was thinking you went here, that's what you'd like. So I think there are, certain assumptions we make. And sometimes if you just raise your hand, it's not easy, let's be honest, and just say, hey, let's, can we talk about this? Most people really just want to do the right thing and help you out with that.
Yeah, I want to underscore something just because one of my roles at NYU Stern was running the career office. It's my first role at NYU Stern. And one thing we'd always say is like 85% of jobs are through networking. Yeah, everyone applies, but you have to find someone or someone who knows somebody. And the challenge is, and that's why that was one of the things, build your network and meet people that are different than you and mentor people that are different than you, is that, typically we don't have that diverse networks. Networks are kind of like who we are. One thing that some people suggest is look at your LinkedIn, networks and how much they look like you or how much they look different. And how should you diversify that? Because really it's about network building so that it isn't, to the point that was made, it doesn't have to be just HR doing this. It could be, through the network. So as you expand your network, that's one way to make a difference in there. So the next question I'm going to create some framework around, but it's really for Ken, and it's how can we still make white men feel important too? And the one thing that I will first say before we turn over to Ken is that, this concept of diversity, one things I do day one orientation, we define diversity, and it's a collection of different people. And so you need to have, white people as part of that. Sometimes the first day of my class leading inclusive team, someone might say, well, I'm taking this class because I'm not a diverse person. And, as an individual, you can't be diverse. You need a group to be diverse. And so you need everyone to kind of play this game, so to speak. Everyone needs to have a role. And you shouldn't have anyone, whether it's white men or any, or men in general, say, well, the diversity thing doesn't involve me. It actually involves everyone. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ken.
Yeah, I was afraid you'd turn to me for this one. I'm struggling with how to answer it because it's not an either or, I guess is how I think about it, right? I don't want to push white men aside and be like, you stink, and you're to blame for everything in this country, even though they may be. But it's not, it's more for me to just look around and say, this person may need a little extra hand. This person who I see around me and who I know, they may, by definition, just not feel as comfortable coming into a new environment or switching teams or something. And so I'll go a little bit more out of my way for that. And I don't know how to answer it other than that, Gary. I think it's a fair question, right? I think people don't want to feel, whether you're in the majority or not, you don't want to feel, incrementally marginalized. Mm-hmm. But my personal opinion, this is just Ken Goldman speaking, is that white men in general still have an incredible number of advantages in this country, and I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, I think the thing is, even these 10 things we're talking about, the goal is that we all do them, right? And that's why I was so happy that we were able to put this diverse panel together. Everyone can do this work. It doesn't really matter how you identify. It's just the fact that you engage in this work and these 10 things that are, like you said, it's just something that you can just bake into how you operate and how you work. So as long as everyone's doing it, things will kind of work the way they should work. Certainly want to do things to measure it, like we talked about earlier, see if it is working. But the idea is that we all kind of participate in these things. So the next question is, building on Ken's comments around providing team members with the time to do affinity group work, any thoughts around helping to prevent burnout with individuals who are passionate about this work? Now, I'm going to start, but certainly this is open to anybody. First of all, I think, there's a couple of things. One is typically this work is obviously in addition to people's roles. Some people might do this work and think, I may want to do this professionally. And certainly doing this work is one way to find that out. there's a difference between someone saying, I want to transition to do this work to, I don't either have the time to do the work, but it's important to me. It could be that someone has an understanding of what their boundaries are. Do they show up and support affinity groups that matter to them and, participate in more detail when they have windows of time to do so? Because in theory, this is something that's supposed to be going throughout the year, not just one time. And so it's really about managing, someone's workflow based on when they can give or when they can just show up and receive whatever is happening in those groups. So I think it's about balance, like with anything else. But I don't know if anyone else had anything they wanted to add. Okay, well, it's good because we've got other questions. So the next question is, what non-ERG activities promoting inclusion to employees are proving to be successful in your workplace? And that's for any panelists. And I'll tell you some research. This is something we actually talk about in, it's an article that Harvard Business Review did where they did research, and they found things that don't work are grievance systems or required diversity inclusion trainings. The things that do work are empowered affinity groups. Things that also work are having people specifically focus on diversity through diversity task forces, which I think was mentioned a couple of times. Having specific recruiting efforts targeted towards diversity. Those are some of the lead things that get results, according to this Harvard Business Review article. But things that are required, like diversity training, tends to not, because people look at it as check the box. Grievance systems typically do not, and that's why I mentioned restorative justice, which is very different than a grievance system. Is something. So the next question is,
hey, Gary, can I jump in?
Sure,
I know you're rushing for time. I just wanted to give one quick example and tell me if this is a little more off topic. But we had here, there's a school, an elementary school in Manhattan, and over 50%, I believe that's correct, of the children in this school are homeless or are severely disadvantaged. And most of them, it's New York City, right? Most of them are people of color. And I'm sure if we went to a more rural area, it would be not that. So it doesn't really matter. It just happens to be people of color in New York. And we had a group of 5 or 6 people, just informally, went to this school and read stories to the children for about 2 hours. And we were amazed by, how into the stories the children were, how satisfying it was for us to do it. And that brought us as people closer together. And it didn't really have necessarily to do with, it was informal, right? It was not something that was ongoing. It was not something that JP Morgan really officially sponsored, but it was something that allowed us to experience something different and see the world in a different way that I don't think we would have previously. And the reason it was able to be done is we're part of an organization already. So someone posted something, 5 people signed up, that was it. So there's little things like that that can be done that are a little more creative sometimes that can, just help you out and help other people out too.
Yeah, I think the key to all this is just kind of staying in the game and saying, what are the things I'm doing, to learn about people that are different than me, and how can I engage with people in ways that are natural for me to understand more about these differences, even if you're not talking about them, you're just in the same space, right? So I think that that's really what it's about. And I think it all goes back to this mindset of when you create diverse environments where people have a sense of belonging, that environment will outperform one that's less diverse. It's just that mindset that you'll be better because of it, not that you're going to be this good citizen. It's something that makes organizations better, So we are at the end of our time, unfortunately. This was such a great conversation. And on behalf of Stern and NYU, I want to thank Dana. I want to thank Lydia and Ken for joining us this evening. And I'd like to thank all of you who've kind of tuned in, our Stern alumni for joining us and for your support of this program and of Alumni Week. I encourage you to stay engaged with the Stern community through upcoming Stern alumni events. And I look forward to the day we can once again gather in person, which is coming up soon. So I want to thank you all and wish you all have a wonderful day, great week, and continue to stay connected to us at NYU Stern. And again, thank you, Ken and Lydia and Dana, you've all been great. I know everyone learned from this, so best wishes to all of you.
Thanks, Gary.
Thank you.
Thanks.